Okay, so I'm going to follow up on some of Dan's recommendations to talk about things that might be different. As opposed to talking about cases, I'm going to talk about global health. And I hope that's interesting, but it's really a talk about people and how you get to know people, how you get to become interested in treating people, how you persevere. I mean, you may think one of the best ways to learn to persevere in something is to be a Cub fan, because we only see a championship every 108 years. So that's good. But I'm going to talk about global health from a very personal basis. So you might learn a little bit about me, and if so, that's good. But I hope you learn some lessons about what it's like to have a life where you take 2 steps forward and 1 back a lot. Now you persevere and what you learn at every step of the way. So let's see if that works out, and you guys ask questions whenever you want, or I will ask them of you. Okay, so it's an ambitious title, but I really want the residents to think about what they're doing, why they're doing it. And often the motivations that people that start in medicine are really still very pure and very noble. And it's kind of important to preserve that through your life. So what's the issue in global health? Well, first thing is neurosurgery is finally beginning to think globally. We've been literally decades, 100 years of individual cliques of universities or cities, or Sweden, etc. The reason is that the disparities in specialty healthcare are far greater than anything. When I was in school, I was told that I could only really do global healthcare if I did infectious disease, and I've always been one to not pay attention to the superiors. So I set about proving that specialty care was as important, because the disparities between what we have here and what you'll see in the rest of the world are stark. Specialty surgery. That wasn't clear to everybody until the last 5 years, but it was clear to me a long time ago. Maybe we'll see why. The numbers are all well known. There are 28 nations that have no neurosurgeons. There are many that have one for every 8 million. You see one for about every 80,000 people in the U.S. What does that mean? Well, it means that if you don't have a neurosurgeon, you don't have access to a neurosurgeon. Even though we are 1% or less of the healthcare system in the U.S., you get a maldistribution of essential services. You can't really address diseases which are as important as infectious disease, like CNS defects, congenital defects, benign tumors, pain, tumor, cancer, stroke, without it. And what happens is your trauma system collapses completely. Now, I've given that speech to numerous ministers of health in countries around the world, so I've gotten pretty good at it. But it is shocking to see what happens when you actually get out and see people. So it's the next lesson that I think you need to learn is we have a very isolated bubble that we live in, and you have to get out and you have to see how other people work, live, how they solve their problems, how smart they are. You'd be proud to work with them. I told you this would be kind of a personal journey, so it is. This is Chicago. This is where and when I grew up. And this is that city that Carl Sandburg called stormy, husky, brawling city of big shoulders. If you've ever taken off from a plane from O'Hare, as you swing off the southern runways, you'll see massive rail yards and locks and dams along the river and the railroad connections. And that rail yard's about 5 miles by 3 miles in size. That's the next to the south of that is the canals and locks and barges and rail yards. In that are the factories. So I grew up in a neighborhood where to the south they made all the diesel locomotives that pulled the trains in the world at electromotives. To the east of me was the huge mile-by-mile factory of Western Electric that made every phone in the Western world. To the north was the factories for International Harvester that made the tractors for farms. Down the block from my house was Alcoa aluminum factory. and a quarry, and around it were these rail yards, which was the story of my father, my grandfather, my great-grandfather, and where I was expected to work and did. The future was of that. I was started to work when I was 8. I was a teamster. I worked on the docks that supported those rail yards. I was expected to join the Army if I was lucky. And a couple funny things happened along the way. They were, they just happened. I loved to read. I tried to read every book in the local library. I got used to that. I loved to teach. I started to teach my family, and I started to teach my school, which was important because I went to terrible schools. I actually got into trouble for teaching my fellow students too much. But it was that brawling area. That was my life. I loved it. Where my people may have aspired to join the Army, some of my classmates aspired to join the Mafia Army and did. So I learned quickly it was pretty important not to have a reputation just of a brain or a brainiac, because they didn't live very long. So I nurtured a reputation as an athlete, which was much more safe. And then a funny thing happened. They're called scholarships. And suddenly I had a bunch of scholarships to go to phenomenally good colleges and then eventually med school. The first were both athletic and academic, but they changed my life. They were opportunities other people don't have. It was one of the lessons I learned. I also learned to take advantage of those opportunities. And along the way, I worked, and I became interested in people who didn't live in the cities. So at one point in my life, I was building houses in West Virginia. Unbeknownst to most people, I'm the second best roller skater in Gilmer County, West Virginia. I met people like this gentleman, the best carpenter I've ever met in my life. Learned what it was to be a master at something. I also learned that I was better at some other things. And I was very interested even then in healthcare, and that these people lacked it immensely. And I did want to do something about that. So after I got one of those scholarships was the University of Chicago, which was such a change in culture from what I had grown up with, that no one in my neighborhood actually knew where the University of Chicago was. I used to walk to the hospital with the Nobel laureate. My first day at the med school, they literally singled me out, and a full professor took me aside and said, "What are you, the token Irishman here?" I got in his face and said, "Yes, I am." And he loved it, which was a lucky thing for me. Because, I got called to the dean's office a couple times too, but I was different and I enjoyed it. And so when I became a neurosurgeon, it became part of my career to go there. And I spent 12 years in Appalachia. I worked at the University of Kentucky, and my global health was in the United States. This was where my clinics were. I knew more country singers' families than you could shake a stick at. This is Hazzard, as in Dukes of Hazzard, or Bloody Hazzard if you're a historian. This is Old Tipple. This is the dichotomy you'd see, laundry on the porch and the world's largest TV antenna. I liked it. I learned about people. I learned we were all the same. I learned their needs were great. Their opportunities were few. And I had been very lucky to have opportunity. And so I was interested in service. The opportunities changed for me when people here in Kentucky said, would I join them to go to Guatemala for a service mission? I said, sure. And it changed my life because the need there was spectacular. So it's time to unmute. Young one, where's Guatemala? It's my way of telling if anybody's there. Somebody can help her. Any residents? Where's Guatemala?
Central America.
That's good. That's good. What's different about it? It's all about the people. This is the country where the majority of the people are indigenous. That doesn't happen anywhere else. Just because of pestilence and disease that came when when post-Columbus, but this is indigenous, so it has very special needs. The needs are overwhelming there, but I thoroughly enjoyed the work. When I went there, I learned several things. I was very, very ineffective. This was more about me. I was becoming fulfilled by doing medical care there. I learned things. I learned that people were crowding into the capitals, to the cities, which meant that the countryside was completely devoid of care. I learned that that meant there were unique transportation problems. How do people get to a doctor? How does medical care get distributed? How does healthcare get distributed? One of the most important things, besides that we are all alike, is I learned that I couldn't do a darn thing in a war zone. This guy here has literally just been shooed away from my clinic by the nurses because he stuck a rifle through the window of my exam room. I have often asked you guys to do a focused neuro exam. This focused my neuro exam big time. But this was the middle of the Civil War, and I learned that the people I trained were being singled out for harm because as educated people, they were a threat. So that if I was going to achieve anything, I couldn't do it alone. I had to have a stable country, I had to have a stable government. But there was tremendous need, and I would never forget this area. So I moved, and I began to think that this young lady, actually, pictures in my office, is the lady that I look at every day because I had seen like 100 people that day in a medical clinic, and she was healthy, and I wasn't coming back to that town for years. Who's going to take care of her? I realized I had to train somebody to be there. So I began to train doctors, starting in Guatemala. To do that, I needed a more stable country. I needed more stable. And so I began to think that if service through education makes more sense than just service, because when I'm not there, nothing gets done. So that's insufficient. It's not sustainable. I began to learn and think from my mistakes that I couldn't maintain any educational system if I didn't have peace, social stability, enough food, and basic medical care so the people I trained could stay and do services. I couldn't do it alone. And I couldn't stop wars alone. So at that time, I stopped doing the Doctors Without Borders sort of thing and started looking at places we could do education. So the next place I went to was Ecuador, because although it's very diverse, large indigenous population, it had oil, it had a strong possibility for economic growth, it had a middle class, and although it really turned over governments rapidly and often by coups, they were relatively nonviolent, and people welcomed you to come, a stable middle class. So I went to work with that, working with their doctors and teaching one-on-one, had nurses teaching, had anesthesiologists teaching. Began to quickly understand that teaching neurosurgery was insufficient. It had to be horizontally spread across the health system that could grow, people could go on when you're not there. And I also learned this. I learned that I could incorporate my family. At this age, my kids started to go. It was very important. It was very important as far as you teach by what you do. Lectures don't really cut it. People watch what you do. And so that's what our family grew up doing. This is my daughter. At the age she said she was really tired of going on a health mission and just lifting boxes around the storeroom. So she taught herself Spanish and took over the recovery room. She literally would tell the doctors, this is a sick baby, this one's crying, come here, where's this, where are you going to go? She was 8 years old. But at that size, when there was a crisis, she would run to get me, and she couldn't distinguish me from everybody else in scrubs. So I started to wear the red cap. I wear the red cap so she can find me in the OR. And that tells you a little bit about me, but that's where it came from. And that's why I do it to this day. So what did we do? What did we learn? Well, we learned that you look at what they've got, what's their strengths, and what's achievable. The thing that became clear at that point was the thing to try to achieve would be a residency. There were some smart neurosurgeons there, vastly overwhelmed. They needed resources, and they needed partners. And I could be a partner on my trips, which I was doing on my vacation time when I was at Kentucky. Here now it's part of our global health mission, but there it was vacation. And to do that, we needed to look at what were the needs. I told you I learned about Guatemala, about the transportation. We began to look at distribution. There's two ways to do that. You bring the patients to you or the doctors to the patients. We did both. Began to learn that the key to the whole thing was to get the Ecuadorian doctors to take ownership. If you drop in, do 1 million shunts or cleft lips and fly out, they'll hate you because they do the post-op care. You've depleted their resources. If you build their program, they take it over. They will love you to come as their teacher or their mentor, and that's really what you have to do. That's a lesson I learned. You teach at every level. The nurses taught, the doctors taught, the residents taught, the med students taught med students. That really became important. And what I learned was presence is everything. Most of your communication, most of what you teach people is nonverbal. Are you present? Do you care? Did you mop the floor? Did you clean your own instruments? And of course, the person teaching me how to clean the instruments is my wife, Diane. Equipment, can we get the base equipment? And can I learn to operate without all the fancy tools I have here and teach them how to maintain it? That means I need infrastructure. I need biomed people. And I need more than neurosurgeons. So modern techniques with minimal equipment, bring useful equipment, train the people, build the infrastructure, and learn from the people there. Here's my daughter, a little bit older, marveling at the fact that they reuse the gloves for tomorrow. Well, guess what? We're doing that now with our PPE. Where did we learn it? We learned it there. So there's always challenges. You might think this is, just an uninterrupted story of what you did. It isn't. The 2 steps forward, 1 step back happen all the time. The power goes out every day. You have to learn to be calm. The lights go off. What do you do? What's 1? What's 2? I once dropped a wall into a courtyard just to get light into the room when the backup generators failed. Lost equipment means it was stolen. What do you do? Well, I carry it on my back, and then I begin to get the local volunteers to be involved in keeping it. Volunteer illness, which can be fatal. Civil unrest, transportation, government overthrow, and my favorite, volcanic eruption. That'll slow down your operating rate. Lights go out. You finish a case and you find you have 2 bodyguards. You say, well, did the government fall today? They say, see. Okay, hope so. And this is the volcano. This is the hospital. This is the volcano. And literally, only because the wind's blowing the other way did we keep working. The lava flow, fortunately, was stopped by the river. And this is the need. This is the end of my clinic. So I just had to say, well, I'm going to keep going another next day, as long as I'm here. This need's always there. I can't solve it alone. I have to train people. So we succeed when we think about care, equipment, and ownership by the people that are there to mentor. So we're teachers, and that's really important. And it becomes teaching by what you do, not so much by what you lecture. What you do you come, are you present? These are medical students that would flock because I would teach in between cases. And they would come throughout the whole country. That became pretty special. Began to think teaching medical students was equally important. Just as I began to think teaching biomed people was equally important. And so I became more and more involved, and I became more involved. I came to the attention of this organization, Foundation for International Education Neurological Surgery. I now chair it, but I started out just they were interested in me. They had started 51 years ago, and they had started serving. They were on hospital ships. And I gradually said, that's great. I love what you're doing, but you need to think about education if you want it to be self-sustaining. So be careful what you wish for is the next lesson, because they made me the secretary and then the chair of the place. So what is it? It's an organization of partnerships. It has very little power. That's like a chair. They have very little power. But if they can come up with good ideas and get lots of other people to work together, then you'll create something. Global neurosurgery need through education, primarily trying to get a self-sustaining program of care. And my model was start and maintain residencies. Because if you have a residency, you have to have a hospital with equipment, you have to have the government buy-in, you have to have the support, you have to have anesthesia. And then that naturally, those needs would fold out that infrastructure that may mean that they could then recreate that in a secondary city, another city, until it spread throughout the country and took care of that transportation and centralization onto the capital, which afflicts so many of those countries. And so we began to develop our own curriculum. We refused to dummy it down. It's based on the U.S. curriculum because I was the head of the senior society when we wrote the U.S. curriculum. Equipment and aid, that's difficult, but volunteers and people to build to repair it came, and we began to look at other specialties besides ours. That if you do curriculum and you want the people to stay in their own country, you have to get local certification and you have to have postgraduate education. That seemed to be natural. So we began to look at this idea that service through education and teaching was academics and academics were teaching. Okay? So that meant that we would get as many partners on board to develop a training program in multiple countries. Not only curriculum, materials, and drills, but we would need champions. That meant someone in that country that had been trained in neurosurgery, maybe in England, maybe in Israel, maybe in Chile, who was trying to make their way that we could designate as the program leader. And then a medical school in the States or in Canada or in Europe that would adopt that as a dyad and begin to understand what the needs were, carry it out. So we went to many countries. So, Kelsey, where's Nepal?
It is in Asia.
Very good. What's it famous for?
It has the Mount Everest.
That is true. Half of it. So this is the mountainous country in Asia, extremely poor, bad history of governments, great possibility for positive change, caught between two of the largest and most warlike countries in the world, India and China. But it had some bright people in Kathmandu. It had, and this is Merwin Begin, former chair of the Foundation for International Education, who went there, adopted that, set up a dyad with his home program, and developed the first training programs there. So this was being done. This was India when Calcutta was called by its old name, and doctors giving back to their own country, trained in the U.S. here and in Madison and in London, went back to develop programs in areas of great need. 16 years ago, after working mostly in South America and Central America, we became interested in East Africa. That was the enormous need. By this time, our Ecuadorian program really already had a training program. So there was need, and could we import those lessons elsewhere? So this is East Africa, 400 million people and nobody being trained in neurosurgery. Okay, so we've gone Young One, we've gone Kelsey. Sarah, where's Sub-Saharan East Africa? What countries count? Sarah needs help. Who can help her?
Yeah. Yeah.
What are the countries of sub-Saharan East Africa?
Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, sir.
Okay, Ethiopia, Somalia. The point being that very few people live in the Sahara. Huge amount of money in Egypt, Morocco, and South Africa. No surprise, that's where the neurosurgery programs are. Nothing at that time here, 400 million people. A lot of need here, which we're just beginning to address based on Nigeria. But this is where we started, mainly because we were invited. And I'm not one to turn down an invitation. So we started to work to develop a program in Kenya. That meant you had to be present, you had to go, you had to listen, you had to make mistakes, and you had to correct them. You had to be present. This was one of the first people we trained. He runs a magnificent program in Eldoret, which, if you know anything about Kenya, is where all the distance runners are from, really his tribe. And we had local support. Because we were invited, there were 8 neurosurgeons in this country of 37 million. Only 2 could operate, but the others had governmental connections. So guess who was going to be the program director? Guess who was going to be the major teacher? There'd be 2 different people, but we needed to take advantage of that. And my speeches about the need to change the trauma program and to train doctors there, if they would fund the residents, pay their salary, I would provide the education equipment, etc. And in 2007, it worked. Again, this time the Kenyan Ministry of Health said they would found the residency program. We found it a pretty unique thing because the program spanned countries. We get a good peds experience here, an adult experience there, a mentor here, there. It was a wing and a prayer, but that's what we started. Remember that thing I said about transportation? Everybody had collapsed on the capital in Nairobi. 1 hospital, 3,000 beds, 5,000 patients. They get neurosurgical care 1 day a week, rest wait under the jacaranda trees hoping they get picked. Nobody gets cared for. If you're in Mombasa and you have a benign brain tumor or causing seizures or hemiparesis, you're going to close your shop or your farm, travel to Nairobi, your family loses everything, you get unsuccessful surgery, or you die waiting for it. Mombasa collapses, there's no trauma system anywhere. That was my speech to the Minister of Health. What we did was we, meaning mostly the Nairobian doctors with help, set up clinics in the major cities, Meru, Kisumu, where the family of Obama's from, Mombasa, once a month, operate, get the nurses trained, etc. So the graduates of the Nairobi program could be cited there and develop their program. That meant we had to be looking at infrastructure. That meant we had to be thinking, how do you set up a program? Well, that's what the Senior Society did in the United States. We could import those lessons. So the outreach clinics were started. This is the Mombasa clinic. And so the graduates could be cited there. That meant infrastructure. You can't do neurosurgery without neuropathology. It took me a while to realize that. Without neuroradiology, equipment, supplies, ICUs. So everything had to grow at once. But if we could get excitement among those doctors and minimal equipment donated, they would build it. They were very, very resourceful, very bright. It wasn't our program, it was theirs. We would help supply the curriculum or the competence or run interference with the government because they were hoping that we would help out, really helping out. I learned how little you need for an operating room. Think of doing a case with this little equipment. Well, if you do this a few times, you become very focused in your OR back home. This is the first neuropathologist in East Africa. That was because I went and taught how to do tumors in children. And I had done these wonderful surgeries, and I had the doctors thinking they got it. Yes, I understand these principles, and now I can do good posterior fossa surgery. And on the last day, the head nurse took us to the cancer ward where the kids were, and they sang this gorgeous Swahili chant response song to us. And tears in your eyes, you couldn't believe how beautiful it was. And the nurse told me they were all going to die. And I said, what? And and they said, we have no chemotherapy for them, because some would need that. And I said, I'll get you the chemotherapy. I'm an American. I don't understand what you're saying. I'm not listening. And I think it can be solved by money. And she said, you don't understand. And I kept ranting about I get things. And she said, you don't understand. And then the third time I said, what? And she said, we have no neuropathology in East Africa. We have no idea what tumor you took out. We don't know what to treat. I never thought of that because I hadn't shut up and listened. So I learned lessons. I learned to be persistent. I learned to listen. And I learned to think about big picture. How do you solve things? And you do it by developing teams. So I went to the head of pathology, said, who's your newest assistant professor? Does he mind traveling? And then I went to Shahryar and said, Shahryar, foreign doctors aren't allowed to touch patients, but you're a pathologist. Would you mind running a black market pathology program? And he said, sure. And this is now the neuropathologist of East Africa. We have a cancer program. And that's because we build teams. That's the way it started. Equipment came, we got donated. We talked to a lot of equipment companies in the States and said, if you really want us to buy this stuff here in the States, how about the old ones we donated and shipped to and maintained? So I taught people the first aneurysm in many cities in a few countries. Now they're widespread. In December, NYERI had done their 20th in a year. And it's quite doable. And it's care that was unheard of. NYERI is one of those satellite cities that had nothing before. And that's just because teaching and let them teach each other. So we began to develop DYADS where we would link Kenya and UW, Uganda and Duke, Harvard and Uganda, Henry Ford and Myanmar, on and on, UAB and Vietnam. And they would go and say, this is the needs. Well, we can donate that equipment. This is the sites. Hey, why don't we begin to teach? In doing, we began to link online because people smarter than me about electronics, these people, they had access to Wi-Fi. You didn't have to bring books. You needed passwords. And they began to correspond with U.S. doctors, U.S. universities, and teach us. And so every time I went, I learned. And every time I went, I took the red hat. And then the government began to get involved. This is the president of Tanzania. This is the day he promised me he'd put 15% of his national budget in healthcare if we'd help. We don't get that from the state of Wisconsin, guys. This is the first Pantera microscope I had ever seen. He bought it for his hospital in Tanzania. I had to set it up and then say, this is cool. I want them here for Mustafa, me, and everybody else who comes. So you learn things. You learn things everywhere, every day. And this very active idea of a dyad program meant that equipment was important and that we would publish on this. And we actually published that we raised the quality of critical care, of anesthesia, of general surgery by building neurosurgery. It was completely the opposite of what people had taught me, where I had to start with primary care because primary care would run to catch up. And that was really wonderful. And it's very important because I had been arguing this for years, and suddenly it was beginning to make sense. The Duke program really took over Uganda. This is their Minister of Health. And the ECUADOR program became self-sufficient until their own programs. Now, I'm not saying it's the same as it is in the U.S. I'm saying it's really substantially real care, went from nothing to something. And that something is being taught there so that it can grow. And that's tangible. To expand it more, we needed more. So I went to the World Federation of Neurosurgical Societies. The WFNS is this troubled program that links all programs of neurosurgery in the world. And that has access to some brilliant, brilliant people, some people with great political connections, and some people that are just very, very thoughtful teachers. And they were teaching, but they're teaching in places like St. Petersburg because they wanted to go to the museums. So I taught, and they said, you should be on this committee. I said, okay, but I want to help plan, and let's do it in Kenya. Let's do it in Southeast Asia, and let's begin to teach not how cool I am with doing spinal angiograms, but how do I do practical problems? And that changed the way they did their education. Then we partnered with other programs. This is the hospital in Zanzibar before. But this program, which is a program of Spanish neurosurgeons, adopted it and built this hospital, a neurosurgical center in Zanzibar, where they previously had no care whatsoever, and staffing and training. So a Tanzanian graduate will be cited here. And they grew. As we began to look what you could do, we cited the courses there, and we brought people worldwide. These are some virtuoso Japanese surgeons demonstrating their techniques and learning from the modifications that the Africans had used, how they could be practical, how they could be efficient, how they could work with limited resources. And as it grew, they began to get better and better electronics. MRI came to Africa while the time I was there. We started with occasional CAT scan. Now we can get an MRI at least in every capital. And then it went to Asia, because why not? Not only is there need in Southeast Asia, but there's enormous, enormous resources. And so in Korea, we found that several of our trainees in Turkey, in Korea, are now professors. Very grateful for the training that they got here, and more than happy to be involved and donate time, equipment, resources, because it's not about us, it's about how we get the care out to people. They're very, very difficult sites. I want to cite two of them that we've been working on more recently. Zimbabwe is one of the more troubled countries in the world, and it's just because of remarkably poor government. But when Robert Mugabe reached 91 years of age, these young people said, we're going back. It's going to change. Would you bring your education program? And these are residents and young doctors that had left and came back. So we're trying to start programs there. It's very difficult because the lack of stability in that country. But rebuilding infrastructure is what we're trying to do. And we're doing it in a well-built hospital from the British colonial times. But that's what they have. That's the available resources. Hardest project is Haiti. Haiti, as you know, has suffered from remarkably poor governance. And the earthquake only made things worse. The U.S. response was not very well thought through. What we did was pour aid and service onto this country. What does that mean? Well, we poured so much food into Haiti that all their farmers went out of business. They couldn't compete because they couldn't sell their food. We made them a dependent country, not a self-sufficient country. And the problems with education were worse because the governments would say, well, these people are flying in to do the care. And they did not allow a training program we developed. So I said, well, to my friends from Miami, I have a lot of titles. That's all I've got. Let me go and help and then meet with these ministers. And because I was the head of this foundation and the international coordinator for the World Fed, I said, you need, if you want to have a trauma system, if you want to have care, regional care, you need a training program. And then we got it. So we have a very rudimentary training program there. But the need is enormous. My favorite sign, how's this in your OR? Ventilator stops working abruptly. Or this, 8 people to a bunk. 4 patients, 4 mothers to a bunk. So I learned that the needs are great. They are not overwhelming, but they're going to take a long time and a lot of steps forward and steps back to solve them. And I can't solve them alone. I need to get buy-in by the local people, and I need them to take ownership, and then we can do something. A huge thing happened 5 years ago. After years of telling people that essential surgery, essential neurosurgery was as important as infectious disease, the Lancet Commission came out with the evidence that that was true. They said that 5 billion people lack essential surgical care. Absent that, you have 47 million unnecessary deaths. That makes Ebola look like a small-time disease. And indeed, this lack of care, especially in stroke, will surpass infection in the developing world. So suddenly people began to have scientific data about what we've been saying, and everything changed. The World Bank said this is costing us $17 trillion, and this lack of care has to be addressed. The World Health Organization, which is part of the UN, unanimously, that never happens, every minister of health in the world said surgery must be a priority. We must train them, and must train them in their own country, because otherwise if we take them to England and train them, they're going to stay. Because there's no infrastructure back home. Who trains surgeons? Next thing I know, I'm flying to Geneva. And everything took off. Next thing I know, I'm doing 5 continents a year of trying to set up programs. And you don't do that alone. If you think of the people we can partner with, web-based computer curriculum, your curriculum rewritten for the web, grants and training scholarships from philanthropists, web learning from AA&S, curriculum from CNS, the milestones, the boot camps, why not do them in the developing world? I'm not going to dummy it down from the senior society and the ministry's support. So that's what we did. Things took off. We did the postgraduate education, boot camps, etc., and we began to highlight. I got a call from this lady. She is both a neurosurgeon and a senator in China. She said, we have 1.3 billion people. You have just given a lecture in Africa about credentialing, curriculum, and standards. We have none of that in China. We have some of the best hospitals in the world and some of the worst. We have herbal neurosurgeons, for Pete's sake. Would you come? I said, sure, I'll try. So I spoke about revolutionizing teaching of neurosurgery, setting national standards at the Chinese Congress of Neurological Surgeons. And I learned another valuable lesson, which is be careful what you wish for. Because next thing I know, I'm the honorary co-head of resident education in China. Big deal. But we began to roll it out. We did the first boot camp, just like you go to, in another country in South America. We learned that if we force half of the teachers to be from those countries, they learn they can teach. These Bolivian neurosurgeons who had fought with each other because they thought that's what they should do as rivals would come up to me and say, boy, that person can teach better than I thought. I said, yes, you should work together. And they built a teaching institute for neurosurgery in Bolivia, never heard of before. And it wasn't just for Bolivia, it was for the 5 poor countries which surround that area. And we used simple models, ventriculostomy models that are made out of just handmade. They made a beautiful model last year of 3D microscopic anatomy out of latex. We brought it to Africa. We brought it back to Southeast Asia, back to South America, and it grew and grew and grew. And as it grew, it became an international objective from Japan, from Saudi Arabia, from Congo, from India, from Pakistan involved. And that's the idea. It's not about us. It's not about America. It's really about the countries that invite us and when they take ownership. The Uganda program began to decentralize. My friend Ben Wharf had built the hospital in the eastern part of Uganda teaching exclusively pediatrics. In the western part of Uganda, this is Solomon, and this is his university in the west, which would become the third neurosurgical center in that country. And yes, I did the first aneurysm there as well. And then boot camps went to Myanmar, which would spread through Vietnam, etc. And in Chile, this wonderful man, Dr. De Luna, who ran a rich private practice, really wanted to train people. They built models, 3D models with drillable model skulls, dissectable vessels for microscopes, and taught 5 countries. It's fantastic, and got them involved so that they were doing half the teaching along with the American or Saudi Arabian or Chilean doctors. And this is the program in NYERI. NYERI is an area of about 4 million people with no care whatsoever. And based on this, we cited one of the trainees there, but we didn't just send him and leave him alone. We threw a big course. We brought people from worldwide. We told the local Ministry of Health, this is important. You need to be supplying things as we will continue to. We will continue to work with them. And this is amazing. I mean, in the first year, he's done dozens upon dozens of big cases and hundreds of small ones and solved the trauma problem, but he's working alone. We need to train a partner. We need to make it grow. He only has 4 million people to care for. So it's a start, but it's a really significant one. And the buy-in from the local hospitals, government, church is enormous there. It's very, very important. But great problems remain: poverty, war, and the pandemic. So what did that affect? It affects everything. If this breaks out, I can't train it. If I forget that these are the facilities they're working in, I have to think about infrastructure. I have to think about sterilizers, linens, nurses. But that's okay. That's what we do. We're good at it. And what happens? Well, we have to support the trainees. What happens after they're done? They're going to need equipment. They're going to need the community and the local certifying bodies to accept them. They're going to have a sustainable practice. They can't just be sent out there and not be able to feed their own family. So there has to be some sort of income, government or partial private practice and charity practice. Models are different in every part of the world. And they need continuing education. So we do it. No, we can't do it alone. We partner. Finishing graduates such as Ignatius, who's gone back to Cameroon to found the first academic program in West Cameroon. We had philanthropists, the Clacks and Bassett's, to fund his extra training. Because that extra training coming, working in the simulators, working with the dissection lab, observing in our ORs, puts a gold star on them back home. They've had extra training. And teaching them with NIH funding how to be an academic means they might be able to run a training program. They might be able to change things. Equipment might be very simple. This is the base neurosurgical set. This is the base microscope. We can take a moderate OR in East Africa and change it into a neurosurgical OR with a lot of help from these companies and from philanthropists for $26,000. That's doable. And it gets them started. They will always want a Pantera microscope, but we can get them a small one, and we can make it work. The DYADS became essential. Without the DYADS, we don't get this. And so that adopting of a program, which we've done in Kenya and hope to do in Bolivia, for our program after this clears. Government has to be supportive. I've never been successful in a war area. I need somebody that I can convince this is for their own good. And there are many good people in the world, including this gentleman who was the president of Tanzania. And how do we get the community? Well, we must get a certifying body. This certifying body for general surgeons we taught them to certify neurosurgeons. And so when we cited the Dr. Mubasa, we brought people from Japan, Spain, North Africa, Prague, India, Pakistan, Kenya, and said, this person's important, this program is important. And the two people that got us started, the two neurosurgeons trained and staying in Kenya, are now the real leaders of the program in Kenya. And these people have trained this gentleman who now is the neurosurgeon for 4 million people in eastern Kenya out of Mombasa. So we have to see, can the doctors sustain themselves? Without that model, NYERI never works. That man can live as a doctor, have a family, and support it because there is enough income from the cases through the government payer program now, which is new to Kenya. That's been the government putting continuing education. We cite these courses where they are so that they may be recognized and trained, and other people at their level come there. They begin to interact. They're never left alone. Courses go on throughout. And with this, we begin to develop dyads and partners. It's amazing what you know. We began to train nurses. We began to train students. And the students become our residents. The residents become our faculty. And it's very intriguing. When we put them together, it overcomes traditional borders. When we did the boot camp in South Africa, everybody came up and said, hello, hello, hello. And they said, why do they all know you? And I said, well, that resident was our student that we encouraged to go into the program in Uganda. That one is now a professor, but he was our resident at the Kenya program. And the teachers that we had work together would come up and say, you know, I didn't know that tribe who I used to hate was so good at teaching. I'd say, yeah, you should work with them. And then I'd have another tribe come and say, I didn't know that one was. It went on over and over again until education is the way you break down barriers. And that's a lesson you cannot overlook. The goal is self-sustaining care. The key idea is that throughout life, not only you're persistent, but you're learning. And I learned a lot by mistakes. The reason I pay attention to everybody's cases is I don't want to go through life without learning new things. I want to see what works. I want to go to M&M and see what didn't work and why and correct it. And we try to fix everything because as you go into volunteerism, there are stages. You're overwhelmed because you try to do it all yourself. That's the Schweitzer stage. Then you try to fix everything, and then you leave something that's lasting that's not about you. You see, everybody that goes into global health has these role models. This is Albert Schweitzer. He worked in West Sub-Saharan Africa. He was a role model. He encouraged lots of people to go into it. But the impact in West Africa really ended when he left. This is Dr. Tom Dooley that was a role model for me in Asia. Went to my college, but nothing was lasting without education. So the first lesson I learned is service alone doesn't last. The developing world is full of these clinics that were built and staffed and abandoned because it wasn't the idea of infrastructure, of education, of training. People parachuted in, did stuff, and left, and people were left behind. This is the contra example. This is Ben Wharf. Ben Wharf was my partner in Kentucky. When I went to South America, he went to Africa. He built this hospital in eastern Uganda and the educational program and the lasting, sustaining program, which is theirs. He becomes the mentor to the program which they've taken on. That's lasting. So now where we had nobody, we have hundreds that are new neurosurgeons or training to be neurosurgeons. And we're become peripheral and we'll become forgotten. And that's what should happen to a mentor because their trainees should surpass them. So that's the challenge, residents. You've got to surpass us. That's the standard I want you to take. The second lesson I learned is never assume you know more than the people around you. I call it shut up and listen. But when you descend saying, I've read the Lancet report, I know what you need, I'm going to provide it, you're going to find these local doctors are millions. They teach you how to work with few resources and how to work with challenges and how to overcome them. This lady who works and lives in Haiti brought this child down from the mountains with obstructed hydrocephalus. She was tapping the kid's brain, no Fondel, daily for a month and brought the child in on a bus for us to care for. I have never been so shocked, amazed by what the people would do, how they would care for each other. And I learned from that. And I learned it in Ecuador when I made the mistake of thinking I knew what the Amazonas region needed. I was talking to their local health official. I said, what's your biggest need? And I thought it was going to be ventilators and such. And he said, no, it's dugout canoes. I need to bring the patients in from the Amazon. Fortunately, I had been quiet because if you don't shut up and listen, you're going to look like a fool. So do that. Next lesson is very little education takes place in the war zone. As a matter of fact, in a war zone, the people you educate are threatened, ostracized, become migrants. This is my favorite resident. Sorry, you're in this residence. She is training to be the first female neurosurgeon in Mali. I asked her what was her biggest threat. I thought it was supplies and equipment. She said it's Boko Haram. You know what Boko Haram is? It means death to education. She's a female educated in Mali. I came back and told our residents, you have no problems. I have no problems. We're going to support this person. And that's what I learned. And you learn you may have to think on your feet. I once, working in a war zone, got out of the pickup truck and found nothing but rifles. I literally put on a juggling act for the children in that village until the guerrillas decided I was either harmless or stupid and let me go. But sometimes you learn to juggle more than jobs. I learned in med schools how to juggle. It came in very handy. Sometimes you have to think on your feet. Many more times than I've said that. Real progress comes from partnerships. If the Army is your friend, if they help organize the health care, if the government does, you can have success. Because you are responsible. You're responsible for the people you train who may be ostracized or helped. You're responsible for the volunteers you take with, the families, your own, and the people, the patients' families. And there are many threats: illness, transportation, civil unrest, violence. Illness is real. Dysentery is my major concern, not Ebola. I once had 18 volunteers fall sick at the same time, literally fell to the ground during their cases because they had not kept clean water. I never drink anything but water and eat chicken or crackers when I'm there, so I was healthy. The next time I brought A, strict criteria, and B, a doctor to take care of them. I was tired of being the internist. What's the effect of COVID on this work? All international travel programs postponed. In the past 2 months, I've postponed 5 continents of programs, and that hurts. But guess what? The need will be even greater when this clears, and it will clear, because we have to continue the lessons we've taught them. Work online and trust the work that we did to set up their systems of care to help them get through the COVID crisis until we can be back and address the bigger needs, such as stroke and that. Transportation's a problem. This literally is a train I was on. You may not know it, but long before you came here, UW had a group of medical students in South Africa on a medicine group that was hit by a train. So I want to know who's driving, where are you going, how is it safe? Natural disasters, they happen, but they're not my major concern. Civil unrest is. I pull whole programs out of countries near the election time, I'm concerned, and violence is real. This day, my daughter was unexpectedly placed in a tremendous jeopardy, which we got her out of. But it changes your life forever. So, first rule, service with education. Second rule, shut up and listen. That's worldwide, should be every day. Education requires stability. You can't do it alone. You partner. You partnered here today with anesthesia, with orthopedics, with vascular surgery. You don't fight, you join. And your actions make you responsible for many. These are lessons learned that are learned everywhere. You have obligations, and the obligation is to bring those lessons home to the patient you take care of today. Because what you learn from global neurosurgery is it benefits all of us. And that's how you make it part of your everyday practice. What you learn here comes here. What you learn in med school, you never let go of. Because it only makes sense if you spend every day making the world better for your patients, the ones in front of you, the ones that aren't born yet, as you're training people to take care of them. So I leave you with my favorite quote, because Cushing founded neurosurgery, and he had a pretty high opinion of what a doctor did. He is the reason that doctors in the United States are revered, because he was the model of that scholar surgeon that people in the 1920s held doctors up to. Prior to that, they were quacks. So I want you to dare to dream. That's the lesson I have. And I'd like you to open up your mics and ask questions.
Yeah, do you think that we are developing similar problems in the U.S. in various rural areas?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. This idea of centralization of the population is destroying rural areas. It's so very obvious in Latin America, but of course it's happening here. It's very hard to get good care, and especially the United States because the geography is so huge out west. And as I made the point, Eastern Kentucky is a developing country. Its needs are huge. So for that matter is inner city Chicago. I mean, my home neighborhood where I was born needs these lessons every bit as much as East Africa. And that's why you never lose sight of that. That's why we started the stroke program on the Native American reservation. It's right under our nose. They have the worst stroke risk in America. So I'm going to defer for that there. Thanks a lot, everybody. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.